Well, it's 3:30 now, and we're going to start the Shea Lecture 2020 Shea Solutions. And I'd like to welcome everybody tonight or this afternoon, and thank you all for your participation. I also wanted to thank our panelists. As you may know, these are all volunteers, and if we can have a round of applause for our panelists for the last few Shea Lectures. It's been very informative, and now this being our third with our March Towards Solutions, we are going to add a few new people to this screen, but I'd like to first start by introducing today. Our moderator is going to be Christopher Clark. And I just want to say a few things about Chris. You've seen him before at our first Shea Lecture, but Chris is a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch. He is also the chairman of the Connecticut chapter of Bank of America's Black Professionals Group. And Chris also serves on the board of directors of the Urban League of Greater Hartford, as well as for the West Hartford Chamber of Commerce. Chris is going to take it away, and then he's going to introduce President Ed Klonowski, and Ed Klonowski is going to be our facilitator for this discussion, leading us towards solutions. And for those who have been with us in the past, we do have the chat box for comments, and the Q&A box is if you wanted to add questions to the conversation. And we invite everyone to participate and join us in this discussion. And we have partnered today, the Charter Oak State College Foundation, the college, and the West Hartford Chamber of Commerce. We're happy to be here with you today. So Chris, without further ado.
Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, I had to take myself off of mute. I want to thank you firstly for joining us today. Generally, this role would be fulfilled by Glenn Davis with Liberty Bank, who is also the chairman for the Shea Lecture, and serves on the board for Charter Oak State College. Some other commitments at work pulled him away from serving in his role today. So I'm glad to step in, and to begin the conversation, I wanted to share some prepared remarks from Glenn. So first off, he sends his apologies. It is with great regret that I'm unable to join you this afternoon for the finale of the three-part Shea Lecture discussion regarding economic disparities and solutions. This year's Shea Lecture series has been a rich and insightful discourse into racial injustice and its adverse impact as expressed through the lenses of key economic pillars in our society. Pillars such as education, housing, business development, healthcare, financial well-being. I am deeply grateful for the panel of subject matter experts who shared their intellect to help, but more importantly, to challenge us to seek meaningful change to the narrative. The overall objective of the Shea Lecture initiative is to provoke critical thinking and dialogue among students and the broader community concerning crucial social issues. Beyond simply being a forum for discussion, this year's forum is intended to be a call to action. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, the racial divide, the widening wealth gap, and the injustice within our criminal justice system as it relates to the treatment of Black and Brown Americans, this series sought to challenge our audiences to be actively engaged in the solutions. Following today's event, President Ed Klonowski will issue a white paper report articulating the complexities of the issues surrounding disparities, but also highlighting real solutions. This white paper will be submitted to our elected officials and outline a plan for leveling the playing field with actionable steps and requests. In their primer about racial and economic inequities in the United States against the backdrop of COVID-19, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco defined racial equity as the just and fair inclusion in an economy in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco then proceeds to make a powerful declaration. We will know we have achieved racial equity when race no longer predicts life outcomes. That's the challenge before us, but also the opportunity. In his book titled Equality, Richard Henry Tawney, a 19th century British economist, writes, to criticize inequality and to desire equality is not, as is sometimes suggested, to cherish the romantic illusion that men are equal in character and intelligence. It is to hold that, while their natural endowments differ profoundly, it is the mark of a civilized society to aim at eliminating such equalities, as have their source not in individual differences, but in its organization. As a matter of, the matter of racial inequality is not a new phenomenon, but can trace its history to the founding of this nation. Its legacy is intentional and deliberate by virtue of its structure. The Shea Lecture Series therefore endeavors to be a stimulus for change by invoking intellectually honest and thoughtful discourse. I'm appreciative of the outstanding colleagues that serve with me on the Charter Oak State College Foundation Board, and to the wonderful leadership and staff of the West Hartford Chamber of Commerce. Thank you for embracing this topic without hesitation and for bringing your creative and authentic selves to this platform. Finally, and in closing, I'd like to extract a quote from the late Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter written from a Birmingham jail, which I believe befits the times we live in. Dr. King eloquently states, in a real sense, all life is interrelated. All men are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. And you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality. This is the basis of our challenge, but it also serves as the impetus for our opportunity. So thank you, Glenn, for preparing those remarks. Thank you all for joining us. And I'd like to hand it over to Ed Klonowski.
Thank you, Christopher. I appreciate you stepping in at the last minute to serve this role. That was generous and we appreciate it. We're thankful, of course, to the West Hartford Chamber for supplying the technology that we're using. And I'm thankful to all of you, both the experts in the audience, because I'm going to work you all like dogs in a moment. So here's what's left for us to do as part of the Shea Lecture. We've heard from a variety of people on a variety of topics. Some of them have submitted some written materials. I'm going to be asking all of the experts to submit some material. And I'm going to be asking the folks on the call today to have a discussion, topic by topic, around what practical next steps our community can take to begin to bring this vision to life. The problem we're trying to create, or the situation we're trying to solve, is this. We want to create a just and fair economy in which all can participate, prosper, and reach their full potential. That's the goal of our conversation today. We tried to make this as practical a conversation as we could. And so we're going to continue down that road today by kind of coming up with as many practical, realistic next steps as we can. I want to thank Carol Hall in advance. She's going to take notes on what you have to say. Over the Christmas break, I'll be putting together a rough draft document, and all of you who have participated in its creation will get a chance to read it, correct it, make sure we've quoted you correctly, etc., before we submit it for publication. So that's the game plan. I've got a series of topics and people related to them. I'm going to start with low-hanging fruit because Jason Jakubowski talked to us about food insecurity. He also presented some written material that those of you who got Carol's email before this call have, a couple of coherent paragraphs. So Jason, I'm not going to ask you to recreate the problem of food security, but I'm going to ask you to talk to people about what you see as some of the next step solutions. When Jason's done, I'm going to turn to the rest of you for more ideas. Jason, you're on.
You start by referring to the food banking guy as low-hanging fruit. So that was duly noted.
I didn't mean to joke, but I'll take credit if you thought
that was very, 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 very well done. Yeah, I mean, in terms of, I mean, I know we're focused on solutions here, and I think that there's really two different paths of solutions that we kind of are looking at in this particular industry right now. One is the short-term solutions, and I say that, you know, these are crazy times. We are still dealing with a pandemic. How are we reacting and how are we interacting with our clients over the next several months, weeks, even days? We have to constantly reinvent the way that we are distributing food in order to meet the increased demand out there. So there's really two different pieces of solutions. One that we have is obviously figuring out how we help people during this particular pandemic. How do we keep emergency food distributions going during the winter months? How sustainable are they in the long term? Do we want some of them do we want some of those emergency distributions? How long do we want some of them to go? I mean, those are all fair questions. The other piece of it, though, and I think this is where the bulk of the conversation lies, is where exactly are the longer term solutions. And I think if you read some of the prepared material that I had, food insecurity is not a standalone issue. Food insecurity is often a symptom of or a correlated diagnosis with a number of other different things. And what it comes down to is poverty. I mean, a lot of food banks used to see themselves as places that just amass food and distribute food. We have a sign here at Food Share in the hallway. It says we're changing what it means to be a food bank. We take that very seriously. We have a Institute of Hunger Research and Solutions that actually goes out and does research on these particular items, understanding that food insecurity is not just about finding ways to feed people. How do we link those different services? We have hunger action teams that go out into different communities. We have a SNAP outreach program. More food banks, when we started SNAP outreach in terms of helping individuals sign up for SNAP benefits, that was revolutionary when we did that 5 years ago. Now it's almost par for the course among food banks. So food banking in general and food banks in general and this whole industry needs to understand that food security is absolutely a major problem, but it is more of an indication of a larger problem, and that problem is poverty. How do we go about helping to link our clients, our customers with other services that they need? It's practical services like healthcare. It's practical services like literacy, job training. Also simple things like registering to vote and answering the census. Those are all the solutions that we're looking towards here at Food Share, and that I think the food industry, the food insecurity industry as a whole is looking at. We can't continue to keep seeing ourselves as this standalone problem, because we're not. There are so many interwoven themes and interwoven things that we have an obligation to deal with. So the short answer, how do we change things in the future? We're changing what it means. By changing the way that we do emergency food distribution. It's not just about collecting cans of food and distributing cans of food anymore. It's about helping people out in the short term, but also connecting them to the services that they need in order to bring themselves and their families out of poverty, so that they don't have to rely on these services in the future.
Thank you, Jason. And you can see, because Jason's claiming now that while food insecurity is important, it's not a standalone problem. That's the sort of wisdom we've gained from the earlier discussions here. So before I move on to some of those things that Jason already pointed to, are there other suggestions for ways in which we can alleviate food insecurity, specific concrete steps we might take now as a community that would help us do better in this arena? I'm speaking to the whole audience now.
Yeah, it looks like Fred is raising his hand over in the corner.
Yeah, so I actually was on a call today with a group of leaders in New Haven, Connecticut, that was brought together by the executive director of Elm City Housing, which is the housing authority in Connecticut and New Haven. And what we were working on is the creation of a food cooperative that is attached to the housing, one of the housing authorities units. And the opportunity kind of presented itself because there was an announcement earlier this summer that a local community grocery store was going to call it quits and throw in the towel. And so their space became available. And with their essentially going out of business, it eliminated one of the primary sources of food for a low-income community. And so if they just went away, there was going to be the creation of a new food desert in New Haven. And so one of the concrete steps that I would suggest is got to be on the table is to create supply where there are people who are suffering from food insecurity. It's not an easy task, because if it was easy, it would have been done. But I do think that that is part of the solution. And we're trying to combine that. Our initial thoughts are to combine the food insecurity issue with an entrepreneurship, wealth building opportunity for the residents of the public housing, so that they can be trained to actually run a business and to take it from there. So I think that that's a potential solution, and one that we should be looking at.
Fred,
Well,
I can
Go
tell
ahead.
you that I mean, two things. One, I wish that the story you were telling was an anomaly just to New Haven, but it's not. It's happening in particularly in urban centers all across the country. Secondly, the idea of working with a local housing authority and with a local housing group. Again, 10 years ago, that was a radical idea. Now, thankfully, it's becoming the norm in a lot of municipalities. And one of our best relationships is with the New Britain Housing Authority, and figuring out how we combine those two pieces of poverty, the housing piece and the food piece. So, yeah.
Well, you've given me two threads to follow, guys, and I appreciate that. One is the idea of a food co-op that's connected to housing, and we've got the commissioner for Connecticut's Department of Housing. I'm going to go to her in a second. But there's an entrepreneurship piece that Fred spoke to. We have the Deputy Commissioner from Economic Development, so get ready, Gwendolyn, you're coming after Celia. So, our Commissioner, how do you see housing play out in this equity equation?
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting me. Can you hear me? I never
Yes.
know if people can hear me or not. Thank you. So housing, I always just think about, why do we have to argue that housing is important, and to have quality place to be and to be with our family and children? We have to make the case. And regardless whether it is rental or homeownership, housing is basically where we all start, right? In the morning, that's where we are. And for us at the Department of Housing, so I'll start with a couple of things. Is the short-term goal, which is what I can influence at this point. And how can we move the needle to make sure that people understand that housing is not just a place where people that do not work, the stigma of affordable housing. Actually, housing that is affordable to every income levels. And regardless, as I said, regardless of homeownership or rental. And remember that homeownership for many years, and it still is, the primary wealth building tool that we have for our families that are working families, basically. So the department goal that we have right now is to ensure that decent housing is available to all, because we're not looking just at rentals, we're not looking just at homeownership, and we're not looking at low income. We're trying to create a mix of housing opportunities, giving choices, having choices to families to be able to live where they can want to live, regardless of their income. Whether it's in the city or whether it's in the suburbs. And to ensure that all of the state residents have access to economic opportunities through both, because if you have a place that you can afford and you're paying 30% of your income, you have resources to do other things. and then is a home ownership, then you have the opportunity to create wealth. So how we're trying to accomplish this, and very concrete steps that we have been working with my staff. New construction in high opportunities communities. So we are actually promoting affordable housing in communities that have a good school system, that have job opportunities, and that needs this type of housing to continue the growth of those communities. Rehabilitation and preservation of existing housing that is affordable, but that needs to we need to make sure that there continue to be the quality housing and energy efficient, and that provide that environment where a family can live and be able to be successful, and the kids can be successful in school. Activities designed to offer new opportunities for homeownership, and as well to provide assistance to promote homeownership stability. So we actually, CHAFA just announced, Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, a program for down payment assistance. So we're increasing the amount of loans, and it will be, and the interest rate of those loans will be less than the market rate. So that we want to create more homeownership and promote homeownership. So working with the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority and with DOH, we're trying to accomplish that. Neighborhood revitalization, investment in those neighborhoods in urban centers. So we don't want to forget that. We don't want to do affordable housing in suburbs and forget the cities. We need to invest in the cities. And we're going to be working with some of the organizations, nonprofits that are working in that environment. We also have right now, we're trying to prevent and end homelessness. We have rental assistance payment programs. We are creating opportunities around homeless prevention and eviction prevention that we have, especially now with the pandemic and all the issues that is around. We don't want people to be displaced from their homes. We want to make sure that they stay where they are. And then, so those are goals that we are implementing actually right now. The other thing that we're going to be doing is promoting within the small towns and cities how they can develop affordable housing, how they can talk about affordable housing, how they can create plans for affordable housing, where we are providing a toolkit, a guidance. We just finished, we had a partnership with the Planning Association, and they created this tool, a guide that many people say, well, we want to create an affordable housing plan, but we don't know how to do it. And the elements on an affordable housing plan that is going to have the how to do it from community values. So a community wants to create their value. What is that they value in their community? The history of affordable housing in the town. How they can assess what is that the town needs. Is it rental or is it homeownership? And doing the inventory in their housing market, and also just to create the goals for that particular area. And we have been working with several small towns where they have come together and they're working on a particular area on homeownership or rentals in another ones, because they want to bring people into those communities. So as I said, housing is so important, but we just need to make sure that it is created in a way that addresses the community's needs.
Thank you. That's very thorough. And I'm going to go to the Deputy Commissioner in a second, but we've heard suggestions for food insecurity solutions. We've heard suggestions for housing solutions. Now I'm speaking to the audience as a whole. Do you have anything you want to add, practical steps that we could take in either of those arenas that would be useful, and it should be part of our white paper that we're going to publish? Okay, keep thinking, because I'm going to keep coming back to you as we move from topic to topic. But part of what Fred was talking about with his food co-op in, I believe it was New Haven, was adding an entrepreneurship piece to the creation of this new facility, so that the people who came to work in it would also be being trained in how to create and manage a business. And I can't help but think that Deputy Commissioner Glendolyn would like to speak a little bit about economic and community development. With that as her prompt, you're on.
Hi, everyone. Apologies for my tardiness, but can everybody hear me?
We can.
Okay, great. Like Sailor, we always have to do a sound check. um, but thank you for having me again. Pleasure and honor to be a part of, this very impactful conversation. I think, from my perspective as Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Economic and Community Development, that encompasses a lot, right? When you think about how our economy moves, how our communities move, and what the requisite investments and resources that are required to keep them sustainable and viable. So housing, healthcare, education, workforce development, jobs, economic empowerment, they're all transportation, right? It's all a part of, that four-legged stool and ingredients. And so you can't look at it in silos, right? They has to be an integrated approach, if you will. And so, from that perspective, I think for me, some solutions that, I've kind of really been focused on to try to help move the needle, right? Because we're not going to change, 400 plus years of, disparate, institutional structures that have perpetuated the issues that we have today. But it's like, okay, what can we do within our own sphere of influence, within our own work, to help move that needle and progress forward? And so one of the areas has been something that really stood out to me now being in a year into the role is just the prioritization of kind of data collection, like really understanding, what the state of play is, right? Like real time, like what is happening in our communities, how many businesses do we have, how many businesses of color do we have, what are the market gaps? And that just hasn't been an area that was necessarily, the state was good at, if you will. So we've really been trying to, focus our efforts and really prioritize that data. So when a business actually starts and forms in our state, we can ask them some demographic characteristics, because then in the event that we're standing up resources, right, we can be very intentional and targeted to those businesses because we know where they're at, we know how many there are, and we can help move them along the way, as an example, if you will. The next piece is really kind of bringing people into the fold, right, of diverse backgrounds, but also, of perspectives or what have you that are really being focused on disparate impacts and, equity, right? So kind of the equity teams, if you will. And again, because without being intentional about where the gaps are, what needs to happen in a concerted effort and plan to continue to chalk away at that, it doesn't happen on its own. And so that's been an area, where we've really tried to focus on. And so we have the Minority Business Initiative. Dr. Fred is one of our advisory committees. And again, this is a group of entrepreneurs, business leaders, academics that are all kind of coming together with diverse backgrounds, our people of color, right, to really help inform that consistent feedback and flow of how we can continue to progress and what investments, policy changes that we need to be thinking about, we need to make in order for that to happen, which is really important because it's not a static, environment. It's ever changing, ever evolving, and we're living and breathing it every day. And so we need to make sure that we can be responsive to whatever tools that we can put out there as public interventions as market conditions change, if you will. The next piece is really, parity pledges. And what I mean by that is, that can be a powerful tool to really, be firm about, where you stand, right? And again, being kind of intentional about what the current state is relative to how you spend your resources, whether you're procuring goods and services or what have you, and understanding, like, you making sure you understand the state of play, but then also that you can have targeted goals and address those over time, because again, it's a very transparent way for people to track progress, if you will. Which sometimes I think we talk in anecdotes we, you know, say, oh yeah, we think what have you. And I think, again, putting pledges out there that we're all firmly committed to this work and actual concrete goals on how we're going to move that and showing progress helps move the conversation in the right direction. So for example, the McKinsey and Co. did a whole segment on specific Black lives, right? And understanding kind of, you know, the disproportionate impact that COVID has had on Black businesses, but just the decades and centuries, quite frankly, of this kind of pervasive issue that has plagued the community. And, you know, they kind of pointed out where, like, if, you know, you had Black owned companies were able to attain the same kind of average revenue as their white counterparts, they could see $200 billion in revenue, right? And so that's essentially how can we, you know, lean on our anchor institutions, corporates, governments as well, to kind of take those parity pledges and say, okay, we're committed to supplier diversity or what have you, and we're going to make sure that, you know, in these categories, we're going to do local procurement to, you know, Black and brown communities or what have you, that again moves that needle and unleashes a certain level of economic vitality for those communities. That's like a concrete real solution that I think is possible that could happen, if you will. And I want to say, I was reading Cigna, the insurance company here in Connecticut, just did a pledge to kind of raise their diversity supplier goals substantially by like 2025, right? So the more you have people being intentional and conscious of this, the more movement we're gonna see, if you will. Last but not least, I think this is kind of the most important solution, and something that I've personally tried to, you know, really focus on is, you know, economic empowerment, right? And really making sure that when you're working with communities, that they're informing the solutions, right? And they're a part of that conversation. They're a part of that design thinking because they know what's best for them, right? And they actually have a lot of really good ideas on how to solve their problems, right? And so how do you incorporate them into that process and empower them to make those decisions? So like Dr. Fred used the example of, you know, the Housing Authority in New Haven coming together for this food co-op and bringing the community in to be a part of that, right? And so what if you could, you know, work with the USDA, which, you know, has a lot of resources to bring to bear for urban agriculture, right? And how do you bring those resources, bring that education to the community, and people can start their own businesses, right? And create urban farming in their communities, where, you know, that eliminates food insecurity, you know, over time, because you're a community that's feeding itself, right? And that can sustain itself, and you're giving people the tools to do that. And so we have to do more of that. We can't be, you know, sometimes I feel like we get really academic on things and we do our research papers or what have you, and we say, okay, here, do this solution. We're out talking to the real people who are in these communities, who are dealing with these situations, and actually have ideas and good solutions, but they don't have the access, the capital to actually bring that to fruition, if you will. So I'll stop there. I've talked a lot, but hopefully that was helpful. Look forward to the further dialogue.
Well, you left me with a link to one of the areas I want to go to next, which is finances and money. You talked about access to capital, and then that is what that is. Before I leave what you've done, again, to the audience at large, do you have other suggestions for concrete steps that we can take to accelerate the economic development towards equity? Any other ideas?
You know, I think, well, as I listen to Gwendolyn, as I listen to Jason, you know, as I listen to Fred and Selah, you know, as I said in the first Shea lecture, you know, it's a combination of comorbidities. Like all of these things just are completely tied and tethered together, and you know, there's no real extraction point where you can shake them apart and say, well, you know, if we don't take care of one problem, you know, everything else will be fine. you've really got to look at them and adjust, adjust for them all. And I hate to jump the gun and just dive directly into the financial portion of it all, but I think when you look at housing or food insecurity or economic opportunities, they're generally tied to money, right? Like Jason laid out, the major problem is poverty when you think about food, or people's inability to maintain housing. It's a disruption in their income or the disappearance of their income that stops them from being able to have those opportunities. And I think when I have these conversations, people often ask, what can I do? What can I do as an individual? So I think I'll start there. As an individual, you have to keep in mind that things that go unspoken and unnamed tend to go uncorrected and unchanged. So you have to absolutely address the fact that there are disparities, because here we are in 2020, about to be 2021, and it's still a question in some people's minds whether or not these disparities exist. And I describe the relationship that people of color have with this country as like dealing with a toxic ex, right? You have a situation where, somebody punches you in the face and then tells you, to stop complaining. So you really have to look at the state of the world as it is, and realize that there is a problem, because you can't reconcile a problem if, firstly, there's no admission that there's a problem to begin with, and secondly, that the behaviors that create the problem continue to persist, right? There's no step for reconciliation. So I think firstly and foremost, as individuals, we need to realize and address that there is an issue. I think secondly, from a fiscal standpoint, you look at our corporate citizens, which I am an employee of and a member. One of the greatest solutions I heard recently came from Robert Smith, who is the CEO of Vista Equity Partners, and I think on record as being the richest Black man in the United States. And Robert recommended something called a 2% program, in which corporate citizens earmark 2% of their net income towards reinvesting in communities where there are economic disparities. And before somebody chimes in and goes, oh, this is a charity play. No, what they're saying is, do what you're doing, continue to do what you're doing, and turn a profit on what you're doing, but use that 2% to create infrastructure, so that you're removing the existence of these food deserts, so that you're creating, affordable housing, so that you're creating educational opportunities for the people who live in these neighborhoods. It's quite frankly a no-brainer to earmark these, just that small fraction of your income as a corporate citizen, considering the billions and billions of dollars that flow through, particularly large corporations that flow through their hands, and earmark it towards, creating that infrastructure, which then creates, profit for you as a company. And, I based on the estimates I've seen, it creates, like, I think it's been estimated it would create anywhere from $1.5 to $2 trillion in GDP for the country. So it's a win-win.
I've been doing a piece of research into social impact investing, which is what this sort of is. Most of the major philanthropies have invested some of their money into social impact investments and are trying to create social impact investments, because all the philanthropies can do is seed capital. But a social impact investor can create an ongoing business solution to an actual problem. One of the famous examples is recidivism. So you find this small organization that's having a very successful, that is very successful at reducing recidivism. You can measure the savings to a municipality because each imprisonment costs X. So if somebody's reducing recidivism by some rate, you can multiply that out and see what the potential savings are. The problem for this organization that created that solution is that they have no access to capital. They can't grow their operation. So social impact investing says, no, we're going to give those organizations the money they need to scale up. We're going to give them the wisdom because big companies know how to do scale, right? I may not know how, but they do. And so that's a place, Chris, where this idea of a social impact investment in an ongoing successful solution to a community problem, whether that's food or housing or recidivism, allows those small solutions to grow into successful businesses and actually produce a return on the investment. Now, not a gazillion % return on the investment, but a 5 or 6%, something that's a reasonable market rate. So there's already exists an industry meant to support precisely what you've been recommending. And to some degree, it's the intentionality that Gwendolyn was talking about in her piece. All of these activities, when they involve corporate sponsorship, aren't charity. They can be done as a social investment, which expects a return on that investment and gets it. So I think that's a really interesting angle you took on the financing piece. Thank you for that.
Well, I'll look, I'll look at what my company has done. Absolutely, they've done. Bank of America came out and pledged $1 billion over 4 years towards ending economic disparities in Black and Brown communities, right? But from a business standpoint, they also issued a bond offering. What it was called the Equality, Progress, and Sustainability Bond. Raised $2 billion by issuing that bond, but the proceeds from the bond went towards affordable housing, supply chain development, deposits and investments in Black-owned investment companies, Black-owned banks, Black-owned venture capital companies. So, absolutely not a charitable endeavor, but a focused and intentional endeavor.
Right. And I think, well, there's absolutely nothing wrong with charity. What we're talking about in this conversation is sustainable solutions to economic disparity. So Thank you for that. Are there other thoughts in the audience around concrete steps we can take towards creating financial opportunity or financing for the kinds of economic solutions that this conversation's been about? Other thoughts from the audience? Concrete steps. All right, go ahead. I can see you talking.
I hate to be the chatty guy, right? But when you think about concrete steps, so let's go down to the individual level. What can you do as an individual? I've been having this conversation a lot, and just had it as recently as yesterday with a friend of mine who heads up another organization, and he gave a call and he says, like, what can I be doing? And I kind of alluded to this in the last Shea lecture, but I think it needs to be restated. Expand your individual network. Expand your individual circle of friends and circle of influence beyond people who look like you, have the same hair texture as you, the same complexion as you, same religious background as you, or same socioeconomic standing, right? And what that means is not necessarily take some kid, buy them a pair of sneakers, or treat them to a lunch. Invest your time and your effort. Because what ends up happening now is, firstly, I'm a huge believer that representation matters. So somebody doesn't know they can be a thing until they see a thing or conceive a thing, right? So it's very important that if you have the ability to influence somebody else's destiny in a positive way, you kind of owe that responsibility to your fellow human being. So absolutely mentorship, absolutely being an advocate and opening doors for people who don't know that certain rooms exist. And prior to getting on this call, I use an example from my life where my first board assignment was for Charter Oak State College. And that came from my dear friend Jason Jakubowski turning to me one day and saying, hey, have you considered being on a board? Charter Oak is looking for somebody, and facilitating that introduction. And from there, it's had a tremendous impact on my personal network, on my career, and just my outlook on life. So thank you, Jason.
Anytime, Chris. Whatever we could do. But Ed, I mean, I got an answer to your question as well. And I think, I mean, we talked about a couple of different things. I mean, Chris talked about business solutions, also talked about individual responsibility, and those are terrific because those are absolutely a part of it. But you know, as the political science professor, I would be remiss if I didn't say government absolutely has a role to play in this. I would even go as far as to say that government has an obligation to work on this. I mean, you think that I think we tend to be pretty lucky here in Connecticut. I think we've had some great leadership over the last several years. Not just at the gubernatorial and legislative levels, but at the agency levels that have put a philosophical focus on a lot of these things. But we have to also realize we live in a bubble here in Connecticut, and you certainly have seen that over the last year or so when you get into the machinations of a presidential election. Not every state is as fortunate as we are here in Connecticut. And not every state steps up to the plate the same way that the state of Connecticut does. So I think it's important to just remember, you know, we should not be letting government off the hook. And I think that we're coming out of an era, hopefully out of an era in which, you know, there has been a lot of, not a lot of that has happened at the federal level. And I think we're hopeful that that will change.
Well, I mean, just today I'm reading the newspaper, and the conversations are finally getting serious about the next investment they need to make because the eviction moment's about to happen. And granted, they waited to the last possible minute to get serious, and they're not there yet, but it seems as if something's going to have to happen. And so as government steps up and does things, it becomes easier to do the next thing. So maybe there's a reason to be moderately hopeful. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and move into the health arena. And we have with us Brooke and Tiffany, and I'm going to start with Brooke, and then I'm going to move to Tiffany. And Brooke produced some written material. You have it. Carol already sent it out. So I'm assuming she's prepped to talk to us about some concrete steps that we can take to improve equity in that area of healthcare. Brooke, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Ed. And Jason, I'm glad you brought that up about government. And Ed, I was just going to say in your research, it's kind of interesting with in terms of recidivism. And then I'll move on to healthcare. But in the state of Minnesota, we have what are called CIP programs, and it's prison population that is about to be released who have shown great growth within their time, and they're physically moved out of the prison setting into a separate setting, and they're very much part of our community, and they learn skills and trades. They make signs, they flood our hockey rinks. They're just a part of our community, and we see CIP guys all the time. But unfortunately, with COVID and the impact it's had on our state budget, the first programs that are slated to be cut are our CIP programs. And the whole intent is to help reduce recidivism. So just, you know, wanted to throw that piece in there before I moved on to healthcare. And interestingly enough, this panel has been so great, and it's just, you know, yesterday I was involved in an eHealth summit, and Mr. Chris Ross, who's an innovator and an informaticist with the Mayo Health System, was the keynote. And someone had asked the question, if you had known what you know now, what do you wish we would have done a year ago that we've now learned from the pandemic? And he said two things. I wish we were better prepared with public health and public health data. And the second thing he said is, and I can't say this loud enough, but collaboration. We knew we needed to collaborate before, but now it has blown the top off that we need to collaborate. That we can no longer continue on as we are, and we can no longer look back. We need to move forward only from what we've learned, and we need to collaborate. And through the whole presentation, I'm listening and I'm writing down notes, and 3 themes really were kind of pulled out. And one of them has been a passion for me, and that's access. The other was collaboration, of course, and then interoperability, and that's the ability to share information. So it all kind of comes back to that collaboration. But this forum also it was eye-opening to me because it allowed people to be pretty vulnerable. And I was surprised at some of the sharing that happened. And it was a physician from the Cleveland Clinic who was speaking. And we had been talking about, of course, determinants of health. And everybody has kind of that, if you think of an iceberg, where you only see that tip of the iceberg on top of the water. And that's like your 20-25% that makes up the holistic person and the outcomes of their health. And that's health outcomes and genetics, right? Everything below that is what impacts that outcome of health. And it's everything that we've been talking about. In the economic inequities, housing, food, transportation, all of that impacts the total holistic health of a person. And the only things that we are addressing in what we deem traditional healthcare is that very tippy top of that iceberg. And the conversation came up is we have to start collecting the social determinants. And of course, the group was mostly, and I'm so glad there were some payers there, but it was mostly healthcare providers. And as I mentioned, the Cleveland Clinic finished and spoke up and said, I want to do this. I want to do this, but here's my issue. I collect this information and then I see nothing done with it. I never see the loop closed. I know that this person has issues getting to their appointments, but I don't ever see anything happen. I know this, but I don't ever see anything happen. So it's disingenuous for me to collect that information. And so this whole conversation came up, and I don't want to get too technical because this is my specialty is data standards and classifications, but I have to say this. So the World Health Organization, or the WHO, releases what's called the international classifications, and that's all countries all over the world utilize international classifications to capture mortality and morbidity. So that's how we talk to other countries in terms of how many cases, of a virus that we have during a pandemic. So this is how we're able to talk apples to apples with each other, which is great, and we need that. We need that data. We need to share that. We need to collaborate. But the United States is the only country that utilizes the International Classification of Diseases for reimbursement purposes. So what that means is we're, as you know, when you go to a clinic, we're reimbursing your illness, the services for your illness, right? That's it. We're not preventing at all. And so, of course, the rest of the conversation, which is really, really near to my heart, is really focusing on closing that loop. How do we do that? And it's that collaboration. We can no longer have our services, our public health services, our safety net hospitals, our federally qualified health centers that utilize their resources for all of the other enabling services, for transportation, for housing, for food, to be left with HRSA giving them grant funding and then scrambling for other funding to try to meet the needs that we know are there. We can't do that. We have to fundamentally change the culture of care. And care is much broader than just our health outcomes. It is the quality of how we live. It is the quality of the food that we eat. It is being able to feel safe. So it really has to fundamentally change. And we have successfully done that with behavioral health. we have the age-old documents with the Institute of Medicine who were able to tie a person's physical health with mental and behavioral health. And so we were able to bridge that gap. We're able to communicate with our independent behavioral health centers. We can do that. We can expand that safety net to other public health components. All of our enabling services should be able to funnel through federally qualified health centers, and reimbursement needs to go to the federally qualified health centers. It can no longer just be paid to what we call traditional healthcare any longer. It has to change, and it has to change by public health policy. So we need to be really, really driven in terms of how we present it, how we push for it, and how we're reimbursed. So, you know, what I found out yesterday was that there are some health systems who are moving in this direction. And again, it's all based on reimbursement. You have like Kaiser Permanente, who of course, you know, is able to provide their own health insurance. And we're seeing that more and more with the health systems. You know, so I don't know how that's going to play out, but Kaiser Permanente captures social determinants of health, and they close the loop. One of the administrators from Kaiser was talking about they have a large population of patients that have underlying asthma, chronic diseases, and they said they'd rather go to their apartment or where they live and provide an air filtering device and pay for it through their insurance, their own insurance, than have this patient come in through the emergency department 5 times. So there is a huge return on investment. You know, if you think about if you're in the reimbursement arena, you know, there is a return on investment, but the broader return on investment is that quality of life of that patient. And that's what we need to be focused on.
Thank you, Brooke. That gives us a lot to think about. And I can ask you this because you work for me. I can ask you to put some of that in writing and send it in my direction so we can add it to the white paper. Tiffany, before I go to you, I've been told there's a couple of remarks waiting to come forward. First from Celia, our Commissioner of Housing.
Hi, I just wanted to, when Chris was talking about a couple of things that just wanted to mention besides really encourage people. Mentorship is really important. Bring people with you along and provide resources also to boards and participate in board of directors so that you can bring your expertise to as a volunteer to those organizations. But one other thing that as you mentioned, what we can do is for those charitable organizations, when they think about providing resources to nonprofits, make it a significant and make it a multi-year. Don't do 5,000, 10,000 every year, because in these times, still nonprofits are really struggling, not only because they can't do fundraising, but also they have more work than before. So in a meaningful way, if you want to make a 3-4 years commitment to build capacity for a particular organization, whether it's housing, whether it's healthcare, or whether it's a holistic approach in organizations working together that actually can make a difference. So just when thinking about assisting organizations, nonprofits, just think about in a little more holistic approach.
Yeah, we had an experience with that at Charter Oak. We had attracted a donor called the Widow Society, and they had supported our Women in Transition program for single moms for a couple of years. And then in the middle of the epidemic, they decided it was time to sort of end the organization. I think the women that were running it were getting up in years. And so what they did was gave 5 or 6 organizations a very large donation as a way of doing exactly what you just described. Let's see if we can't make a real difference instead of a temporary difference for this particular nonprofit activity. And Charter Oak benefited from one of those grants. So yeah, I can see the difference that makes. The Hartford Foundation has created a way of funding the back office services for small not-for-profits, because that's part of their financial obligation. But for everybody to own an accountant and for everybody to have an HR department, it's too expensive when the organizations are relatively small from a human standpoint. Well, we're waiting for, I mean, I also promised Gwendolyn I'd come back to her. She's got something she wanted to add. Gwendolyn, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. So
It
I
was a
don't
while
mean
ago,
to,
but I remember.
yeah, right. I didn't mean to like reverse order. I know we kind of moved on in the conversation, so it was okay. Because I don't want to disrupt the flow, but I did want to just comment on the access to capital piece and the comment regarding government's role, because I absolutely and fundamentally believe, right, there is a distinct role for the government and providing that public intervention, especially when there's market failure, right? And so, you know, I think we've all experienced through this, you know, pandemic, the economic fallout that occurred through businesses essentially being restricted, in some cases shut down and not being able to open, and the government, you know, literally, you know, pumping trillions of dollars into the economy. And they can do that. They can print money. They have to worry about inflation, but they can print money. And so that's one of those areas where, from a public policy perspective, it's absolutely required for government to intervene. And so from my seat as DECD commissioner and working with small businesses and understanding the limitations for certain communities to access capital, you know, with our limited resources, we really try to be strategic and mindful about really kind of intervening when there's market gaps, right? And so to the extent that we can position our capital to incentivize banks to come alongside us, whether that's, you know, providing a loan guarantee to sweeten up the deal for, so if there's a company that doesn't necessarily fit into the credit box, right, and profile of that bank, can the state come in and provide, you know, a first loss guarantee or what have you to sweeten that, to incentivize them to do that deal, right? And so we're actively working on legislation to introduce next session. We introduced it last session, but obviously the legislative session fell short because of COVID. So we're reintroducing it because we're really changing our whole structure and approach on access to capital and providing capital for small businesses and entrepreneurs. Previously, we had a very, you know, big program called the Small Business Express program, where essentially DECD is a lender, right, for all intents and purposes. And it's not something that's within the agency's core competency. And it's not something that I think, you know, the government per se should be acting as a lender, right? But when there's a market failure, I do think there's a role, right? And so I think, you know, after the Great Recession, DECD and the legislature, you know, stood up this program because there was an absolute market failure. And so they stepped into that role. But as market conditions changed and banks, you know, got footing under them and more liquidity, there was available capital out there. So we were kind of fighting for, you know, similar deals, and the entrepreneur, the small business, was just trying to get the best deal, right? So if I can go to DECD per se and get a 5-year term or 10-year term loan for 3.5% interest, why would I go to Key Bank per se and get a 5-year term at 6.5%, right? So we were kind of competing with the market, which doesn't feel right. It doesn't make sense. And so we've, again, kind of pulled back structure where we're working alongside the banks, and we can incentivize them with the loan guarantee piece, and really kind of incentivizing them to lend in undercapitalized community and underserved communities with our funding, because we know the risk profile may be higher. And so we're willing to share in that risk, if you will. So I do fundamentally think that is a distinct role that government can play, particularly when you're talking about access to capital and financing for businesses of small and medium sizes. And you're not just kind of giving loans out to the business, you know, in Greenwich, right, that can go get a loan and get a capital. And that was happening previously. So we're really trying to change our approach.
We've got a long history of seeing businesses and governments two separate sleds. So when you stepped into an area where there was a collapse in the markets, you just operated like a bank to the best of your ability. what you're suggesting is the better solution is for the bank and the government to pull the same sled together. And government doesn't have to be the lead dog in that sled. If you're providing risk protection for the actual lenders who have experience and a whole staff that knows how to produce loans and collect them, that might be a better deal, pulling the same sled together. So we live and we learn. I like that metaphor, even if it is mine.
Well,
I want a footnote if you use it.
You look at the format that was initially in place for the PPP loans, right? The Paycheck Protection Program.
Yeah.
And it was exactly what Gwendolyn is proposing. It was, the government provides the funding, and the facilitation of the loans is done by banks. Now, there were a lot of problems with the institution of PPP and its impact for Black and Latinx communities and Black and Latinx small businesses. But the idea of letting the people who have the expertise, kind of be the lead dog on that sled, as you said, Ed, it makes sense.
But and to your point, right, recognizing those intrinsic barriers that occurred, right? Anytime, you have the private sector doing their thing, like, you always have to have the watchdog. It has to be a certain level of accountability because it doesn't always penetrate down to, who you're targeting. And that's why I said with this loan guarantee program, we're really being intentional about those undercapitalized communities and communities of color. And also, too, utilizing community financial institutions, right, that are mission driven and mission focused. And this is kind of their heart and soul. This is what they do, right? They fund businesses of Black and brown communities in undercapitalized communities. That is why they're there. That is why they exist. So how can we help fund them and leverage funding from the private sector, right, for them to do what they do best, right? Because they know these populations, they have credibility in these populations, and they know how to penetrate these populations.
Yeah, Jason started us off by talking about how food problems were not a solo issue, that they were connected to all these other issues. And I hear that theme throughout this entire conversation. That even here, where you've got DECD saying, look, we want to create some financial opportunities for undercapitalized areas, it wasn't long before you realized you shouldn't do, it would be better if you didn't do that alone. It would be better if you found leverage points that made what you were doing more powerful. And I'm hearing that throughout this entire conversation. I want to return to healthcare. We heard from Brooke, and she had some pretty interesting things to say, but I want to give Tiffany a chance to talk to us about what she sees as some next steps in that same area. Tiffany, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you. And I appreciate this entire panel in general. And I'm Tiffany Donaldson. I am the president and CEO of the Connecticut Health Foundation. And our foundation is focused on health equity specifically for people of color. And one of the things that, Ed, you just alluded to and Jason brought up very quickly in his discussion is that none of the things that we are talking about is in isolation, but too often we're trying to create solutions in isolation. What we really need to consider are how do we, number one, develop policy and legislation that really focuses on the whole person? How do we consider blending and braiding funding across our government systems and allowing them to create solutions together so that we are coming up with solutions that is meeting the needs of the whole person? What we see in healthcare is that the person who enters the emergency room, as Brooke alluded to 5 times, is often the person who has food insecurities. It's often the person who has housing insecurities and the person who has economic insecurities. That is what we see in the health system time and time again. That's why Brooke alluded to the healthcare system moving closer to understanding all of those social determinants and trying to develop solutions around that. But even within healthcare, we cannot develop these solutions alone. And we need to think about how are we working across systems and working across policy, and again, to treat the whole person. The other piece of this is that coming from a foundation, and I really appreciated the comment around funding, because it is true. And typically our foundation likes to invest in organizations for a significant amount of time because we recognize the importance of that. But in addition to that, we need to continue to determine how can the private and the public sector continue to work together to build solutions. We as a foundation often work with state agencies around healthcare issues, and we need to continue to figure out ways that the private sector and the public sector can come together with creative solutions around how to treat the most desperate populations, in particular populations of color. The last piece that I will say, because I am looking at the time, and I also want us to get to some questions and answers that I'm sure are coming from the audience as well, is that we talked about data, and I cannot, and Deputy Commissioner Thames brought this up from her sector, talking about data. And as a health foundation, we talk about data all the time. Essentially, again, I'm a proponent of figuring out a way to collect data across systems, because we cannot improve what we are not measuring. And at the end of the day, we not only need to collect data, but we need to make sure that we're collecting it by race, ethnicity, and language, and that we're developing solutions that are particular to communities. We often say that we are using a targeted universalism approach. If we target a population to develop solutions, oftentimes those solutions will help everybody. And that is why oftentimes we are focusing on solutions that will help the least of them, because we know those solutions will help the most as well. So we need to continue to understand the problem, to name it. It was interesting that the comment came up that people are unsure that disparity still exists, and I think that's very true. We hear that all the time, even as we go out in our work. But COVID-19 has illuminated more than ever that disparities are persistent and that they are going to continue to widen if we don't develop solutions today that will help COVID-19 and the impact of COVID-19 today, but more importantly, developing policy, advocacy, and structures that will last tomorrow, so that when the next COVID-19 hits us, it does not impact populations of color in the way that we have seen, and that we are not working in silos, because no person is a silo. So I really appreciate this panel for elevating all of the issues, and coming from a healthcare background, coming from a healthcare foundation, we appreciate that all of the people in the panel have really thought about the intersections of health, the economy, and education for one individual. And I really hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation around solutions, because many of the people on this panel are part of the people who are really creating and implementing solutions.
Thank you. I want to turn now to Chris Conway. We'll get back to community development a little bit. Chris, some next steps we can take to improve our ability to develop economic solutions to inequity.
Thanks, Ed. I'm technically not a panelist, but I'm more than happy to
well, you're one on my screen, so you just became one.
Okay, now I'm a panelist. So with nothing prepared, I can share, what the chamber is doing, and Chris Clark is here as a representative of that. Going back early in the year, through Chris's suggestion, to be perfectly honest, we recognized as an organization that we could do a better job of embracing the diversity of our community and the diverse businesses that we have just in West Hartford, but in the surrounding areas. And this suggestion came on the heels of a strategic plan that our board had done, where we determined that our diversity was, on a SWOT analysis, a strength, weakness, and an opportunity. And we decided to run with that. And go back in February, the chamber formed a minority business network, which Chris Clark is our chair. And that group is committed to providing resources, providing access to information, creating networking opportunities, and support for our minority businesses in our community. I would say that we are just starting, but they are certainly doing that. And the conversation has been that this is not an event. This is to be something that should grow and continue to grow forward. And we hope inspire other chambers of commerce across the state to perhaps look into their own organizations and see what opportunities they have within themselves to do something similar that is reflective of their community.
Thank you for that. I'm on a bunch of chambers, and we're all struggling with that same reality. So I appreciate that input.
And I would say that I don't think Chris gives himself or the West Hartford Chamber enough credit in terms of the types of issues that they bring to the table and the types of community action they've done. Full disclosure, I'm a member of the board of that chamber and a proud supporter of the West Hartford Chamber of Commerce. But I would argue that just by being willing to co-host and co-sponsor an event like this is something that is out of the norm for a typical quote unquote chamber of commerce. So, I think that you and your team deserve credit for that. Also, I could tell you again, as members of the chamber, they're very community minded and interested in not just, promoting business and arguing for lower taxes like, the boilerplate Chamber of Commerce in the United States. They take time to raise money for charity. They take time to raise money and bring awareness to local community issues. So, thought your answer was good, Chris, but you guys deserve a real pat on the back. I think you guys do a great job, again, just by being a part of this conversation.
Amen to that.
Thanks, Jason. It's because of our great board members.
Well, that's true. That's definitely true. I agree with
All right, that's enough, Jason. Enough self-promotion. Hey, I want to give Jessie a chance to say a couple of words. I don't know if you've been noticing, but she's been keeping an incredible record of the conversation as it's been happening. So, Jessie, how about if you take a little screen time to tell us what you think about next steps?
I think I don't have any space to say anything better than what everyone has already said. Honestly, I'm so impressed with everyone's perspective and everything that everyone said. And if you guys look in the chat, I've tried to keep up as best I can on the notes that everyone's been saying. So I really appreciate everyone's involvement and being here today. Thank you.
Well, and I appreciate you taking notes, because we're going to have to, again, as I want to tell everybody who's on the call, the goal of this session, the number 3 session, is that we begin to put together a white paper that can speak to the wisdom that we've heard from over these 3 presentations. And so my job is to assemble words from you all and next steps from you all into something that passes muster. So again, I'm going to ask the people who've been panelists who haven't already submitted materials to submit something in writing. It doesn't have to be lengthy, but some of you, and Gwendolyn comes to mind, it had a punch list of the things that in her case her agency's working on. And that's exactly the stuff that we need as positive next steps to talk about in the white paper. All right, we're coming up on 5:15. We're ending at 5:30 sharp. So we've got about 40 more minutes. I want to give the members of the audience that weren't panelists an opportunity to speak. I'm assuming that technically that's possible. They can just unmute themselves and join the conversation. But I want to hear from folks I haven't heard from yet around next steps in any of these category areas: food, housing, economic development. We haven't talked about higher ed, but we could. Certainly mentorship is out there as a thing several people mentioned, but we haven't dug into it. So wherever you in the audience would like to take us, we're in your hands.
As we're waiting for people to unmute, Ed, one of the things that kept resonating as people were talking was the idea of desperate populations, right? And the idea of, of poverty being at the core of some of these things. And one of the things we have to keep in mind is, while that's absolutely true, there is poverty as a result of these economic disparities in Black and Brown communities, that even wealthy Black and Brown people don't escape the fallout of these issues. So, having a significant bank account or having a significant education doesn't necessarily wipe out the fact that, you know, you are more likely to suffer from COVID, or you're more likely to see your business go out of business because, you know, you don't have the resources or the savings to support your business during an economic downturn. You know, one of the things that struck me recently was I was reading a study, and they said that in the Black community, 65% of the wealth that's generated in the Black community goes into servicing student loan debt. So when, you know, we talked a little earlier, and Jason brought the idea of government stepping in and doing something, you know, that's something that doesn't, you know, and I know it's on the table in Washington right now, but the idea of alleviating student loan debt in some portion or completely, no, that doesn't only serve the Black community, that serves, you know, the American population. You know, as I sit in my seat as a financial advisor, there's generally three things that are financially ruinous to people. You know, it's student loan debt, it's divorce, and it's medical bills. Two of the three are exclusively American problems.
That's interesting. Hey, I don't want to interrupt the flow of the conversation, but Fred just sent a note saying he's got to leave before 5. And Fred, we'd love to hear from you one more time before you exit the conversation. Is that possible?
Let me unmute myself. So thank you, and I've been enjoying the conversation and the information. I'm learning a lot, and I'm, you know, my specialty is business and minority business and diverse business in particular. And I have to say that there is a commitment, to Chris's point, by a number of corporations around the country that have been motivated by the dramatic changes in our society over the past year. A lot of it associated with what happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd. And I actually, my consulting company is actually a beneficiary of this, because one of the top 10 companies in the country created a significant fund to try to accelerate minority businesses, and they hired my company to help them think through the formation of this accelerator. And it's going to be a virtual accelerator, and it's going to focus on Black, brown, and indigenous businesses in the green space. We haven't talked a lot about green and environmental issues, but there is, I think, going to be a huge opportunity from a business perspective for entrepreneurs and others to begin thinking about how do we make our society and our world a more inhabitable place for our children and grandchildren. And so, you know, I think that, you know, it's too bad that this is happening in Silicon Valley and not happening in Connecticut. And so if there are any corporations listening to this discussion, I think there is a role to play, a significant role to play, where we can develop minority companies to participate in the economy in more significant ways to generate and build wealth in these communities, because it will, you know, these communities are stuck, and they need help to get out of this being stuck, and that help is in the form of capital, it's in the form of entrepreneurship opportunity, it's in the form of education. And so those are the types of things that you know, I hope get in the white paper as well, Ed, that we address the whole issue of the green economy and the need to provide different types of business education for minority entrepreneurs and young entrepreneurs as well.
It would not surprise me to see the Biden administration speak to exactly that relatively early in that administration, if not in his inauguration address. He's made it pretty clear that he wants to spend money to help the economy get back on its feet. And one of the areas in which he wants to spend that money is the green economy. And he sees it he said this several times, that he sees it as a job growth thing, not as anything other than that. That this is where the jobs are going to be and already are. I mean, I've seen the data. There's more workers in environmentally sensitive energy areas there are in the petroleum industry. It's already a larger labor force. The interesting piece, and I'm listening to all this conversation, not as an expert, but as a participant in the listening piece of it, is how much of what you're telling each other, the rest of us don't know. That the general myths in America about equity and about solutions to inequity don't sound a lot like what I'm hearing in the conversation. So it seems to me that, because I'm sort of a non-participating politician, that the American conversation needs to get better so that we are beginning to understand A, what the problem is, and B, what the actual solutions to that problem might be, where the problem has already been solved, for example, and where it's on its way to being solved, and how we can use those activities to improve the solution set across the whole country. So thank you, Fred. Appreciate you being the kickoff to all of this and being a participant. I know you got to leave at 5. I'll be coming to you for some words in our white paper. Trust me. I know you can write.
Well, I'm very happy to participate. Thank you for including me.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Dr. McKinney. President Klamasky, I
Yes,
just
ma'am.
wanted to just mention that we had advertised this as going till 5. But we can go further. And I know you're like 40 more minutes. I'm like, what, is he a Baptist preacher? No, just a joke. Like 40 more minutes. So Tiffany also has to leave
Didn't mean
at
to scare
5.
anybody.
So if we could do closing remarks and let Tiffany go first, if everyone else is okay with that. Thank you all. This has been very engaging, and I feel that steps are in this paper.
They'll be there before we're done. I have a big stick. We'll get there. Tiffany, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you all. And again, I feel like we've illuminated so many solutions here during this panel. And so I just, again, thank all of those who invited me here, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this conversation. The one thing that I always normally start with and forgot to put in and end with is also around, and Ed, you mentioned this, is that this conversation is different from most. I think that this conversation is different from most because many people on this call are working directly with those who are most impacted. And so a lot of what we are considering and thinking about is informed by those who are dealing with these issues day to day. But as it was already mentioned, I think we need to continue to elevate ways to hear directly from community, and not just to hear from them, but to allow them and give them the space, the power, the funding, and all that they need in order to help us develop solutions. And even as a foundation, we have done this. We've created tables, we've brought state agencies to the tables, we've given the space, and more of us need to, because until we really hear what the problems are, and until we hear from those who are experiencing those problems what the solutions are, all of these conversations are going to be theoretical, and we really won't come up with solutions that work in community. So I really encourage us, those who are decision makers and stakeholders on this call, to continue to work together, because again, we are treating whole problems, whole people, so we need whole solutions, which includes all of us on this panel, and also that we continue to make concerted efforts to hear directly from those most impacted and to give them the space to help us develop solutions.
Thank you. Are there any other closing remarks for the cause?
I could just say quickly, Ed, there's something I've been thinking about. I mean, I've been a part of the Charter Oak State College family for 18 years now as a staff member, a faculty member, and serving on the foundation board. This is the type of convening that institutes of higher education should be engaging in, bringing groups like this together. But again, not just, 20 years ago, it was you bring groups like this together to talk at people. I really admire the fact, and I think Tiffany was just said the same thing, that this is a group focused on solutions, and that your end product is not just, taking this video that you've made from this, archiving it somewhere and letting it sit there for people to look at, but actually coming out with a white paper that the college is looking into putting out there. I think it's terrific, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Thank you, Jason. Any other closing remarks?
Yes, Ed, I want to first of all thank you for this.
Very welcome.
Really not talking about the issues and challenges, but also talking about solution. I do want to say that we have a boss that really encourages us to collaborate. So we at the state level, Governor Lamont, to just bring us all together and give us a mandate, work together, make it simple and make it work. So we have been, I'm delighted working with all my colleagues at the state level, but also Tiffany, as I was a practitioner, I'm not a politician and I always say that. I have been working with my partners, nonprofits, especially on the homeless population, with the coordinated access network, and we provide the resources. And I allow them to have a table, to have a seat at the table for them to guide me on what the needs are, because we have the resources, but I want to make sure that they are part of that solution. And so that's one part of the job. And then the other part of the job on the development side, where we manage about $100 million, trying to leverage that with private investments, we also bring the developers to the table. How can make it simple, how we can make it work, and how we can move these projects to be built, because we need the housing that we have. So collaboration for me is a big thing. I do need to reach out to more of the foundations to get with me to where we are with the government and the resources. And Fred, to your point about green, the Meriden Housing Authority has created a program with the residents, and they're installing the, not the panels, but the roof that are solar roofs and with geotag. And they actually are creating a business so that they, if they don't want to stay within that particular development, they can go out and find other jobs. So that's an example that is being very creative. Thank you very much. Yes.
All right, I guess it's my job to bring this to a close, and it wouldn't be right
I just wanted to say, Ed, before you close up, I just wanted to say, you know, I echo everything that everyone has said. You know, we, as challenging as this time is, and as we continue to navigate, I think it presents, you know, tremendous opportunity. And we will be entering kind of the next economy. What that looks like, I think is yet to be determined, but I think we all have some level of breadcrumbs and insights on what that's going to look like. And so how within our individual, organizational, you know, sphere of influences, how can we, you know, contribute to that, right? And contribute to a more parity in our society. And so I think if, you know, the takeaway for our panelists and everyone listening in is, you know, how can you, in what you do, your sphere of influence, how can you take this conversation, continue these conversations, but in your practice and in your work, embed solutions, talk to the communities that are most impactful, and drive change, right? Because as we kind of continue these conversations and create, you know, the team, right? Like it spreads, right? And that's where real change happens. And so I just want to kind of leave everybody with that parting word, because I know it can be very overwhelming, and these challenges are huge and big and wide and have been centuries in the making. But let's really focus on what can we do, right? And how can we be catalytic for what that future is going to be like and what we want to see.
Thank you. All right, I got a couple of thank yous and I'm going to let you all go. First of all, this lecture series is named after Charter Oak's first president, Bernard Shea, and it's supported by donations from his family in his memory. Some of them are even on the call. So we're very pleased that the Shea Lecture persists and that it memorializes our first president. I want to thank, from a very practical level, Carol Hall, who put this whole thing together with the support of the Charter Oak State College Foundation. And finally, I want to thank the West Hartford Chamber for their technical support. It's been flawless and we deeply appreciate it. To all you panelists, I'm not done with you yet. Thank you, and thank you in advance for your contributions towards the white paper. And that's it, folks. Have a great day. Go forth and do good work. I'm going to leave now. I guess that's the end, right?
I think Chris Conway was going to have some closing remarks also.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay, Ed. Just a couple of just thank yous. First of all, I just want to thank the audience that viewed us live on Facebook, and would certainly encourage you to share this once it's finished. You can then share it, and you can share it with your networks. and people that you think would be interested in it, and it will be up on the Chamber's YouTube page shortly. I know some of them have dropped off, but I wanted to just thank the panelists for bringing their expertise in most cases twice to this conversation, and for recognizing the interconnectedness of all of these issues. And I think just the recognition of that interconnectedness will make the solutions that came up today much easier to implement. It's not going to be easy, but it will be a lot simpler if everybody's on the same page. I'd of course like to thank Charter Oak, Carol, and Ed. Thank you for your leadership today, and Carol, through this process. We were just pleased as an organization when this opportunity to facilitate this came our way. It's certainly aligned with many of the Chamber goals, and we were happy part of this 3-part series. I do need to recognize my own staff. Jesse Bouclier, who I suspect is going to be recruited to do closed captioning for people based on how quickly she was able to transcribe this over the last hour and a half. And of course, Kate Cobes, who when the right person was speaking, they were on, and that's no easy task, and went off flawlessly. So thank you, Kate. And I do want to turn it quickly over to Chris Clark. As this was a partnership with the West Hartford Chamber of Commerce, it was more specifically a partnership with our Minority Business Network. And we are, as an organization, conversation brought up with many of the issues brought up here, but I would like to just turn it over to Chris, who can share a little bit about our programming.
So thank you, Chris, and thank you, Ed. Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Jesse and Kate, for all of your support in putting the Shea lectures together. And within the auspices of the West Hartford Chamber, specifically through our Minority Business Network, which I helped to serve as the chairman for, we are going to be continuing these kinds of conversations under the umbrella of our colorful conversations. So it'll be a quarterly series in which we talk about issues pertaining to businesses that are owned by people of color or represented by people of color. Our first conversation is going to take place on January 7th, and it will feature a panel of state legislators. So them coming to the table talking about some of the initiatives that are underway in their administrations to help support minority-owned businesses. So we invite you to go to the West Hartford Chamber's website and register under our events section.
Any last words from anyone else? Okay, folks, thank you very much. We'll be signing off now. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.